Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1892 had settled upon London with particular malevolence that evening, transforming the familiar thoroughfares into a labyrinth of amber-tinted shadows and muffled sounds. I had been attempting to lose myself in the latest edition of The Lancet, seeking distraction from the peculiar restlessness that had seized my friend Holmes throughout the preceding week, when the sharp rap of knuckles against our door announced the arrival of what would prove to be one of our most perplexing cases. Holmes, who had spent the better part of the afternoon in one of his characteristic fits of intense contemplation, fingers steepled beneath his chin and grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance, stirred at the sound with that sudden animation that invariably preceded our most fascinating adventures. "Ah, Watson," said he, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a cat. "Unless I am much mistaken, we are about to receive a visitor whose troubles will prove considerably more stimulating than your medical periodicals." Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the 17 steps was followed by the hesitant gait of someone unaccustomed to seeking assistance in such quarters, and presently our landlady announced the arrival of Sir Reginald Ashworth, whose name was well known throughout London scientific circles as one of the foremost botanical authorities of our age. Sir Reginald entered our sitting-room with the bearing of a man whose orderly world had been suddenly and inexplicably shattered. He was perhaps 50 years of age, tall and spare, with the weathered hands of one who had spent countless hours among growing things, yet his usually composed demeanour was fractured by an anxiety so profound that it had left visible marks upon his patrician features. His silver hair, normally arranged with meticulous care, showed signs of repeated distraction, and his eyes held that peculiar brightness that comes to men when they have witnessed something that challenges the very foundations of their understanding. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice carrying the tremor of barely controlled agitation, "I come to you because Scotland Yard has dismissed my concerns as the fancies of an overwrought mind, yet I assure you that what I am about to relate defies every principle of natural science I have spent my lifetime studying." Holmes gestured toward the chair beside the fire, his keen gaze already fixed upon our visitor, with that intensity of focus that marked the beginning of his investigations. "Pray be seated, Sir Reginald. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our guest. Now then, you speak of something that defies natural science. In my experience, such claims often prove to be the most illuminating of all." Sir Reginald accepted the chair gratefully and drew from his coat pocket a small object wrapped in silk, which he placed upon the table with the reverence one might accord a religious relic. When he unwrapped it, there was revealed a single red rose of extraordinary beauty, its petals as fresh and vibrant as though it had been cut from the garden mere moments before, despite the lateness of the season. "3 days ago," he continued, his eyes never leaving the perfect bloom, "I was summoned to my conservatory at Ashworth Manor by my head gardener, who had discovered something that even now I can scarcely credit. Within my private greenhouse, in a specially constructed display case that has remained sealed for the past 6 months, stood my greatest botanical achievement, a damask rose I had cultivated through years of careful experimentation, one that had maintained its perfect bloom for over 2 years without showing the slightest sign of decay." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers forming that familiar steeple beneath his chin. "A remarkable accomplishment, if I may say so. I assume you had developed some method of preservation." "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, though the process was known only to myself. Through a combination of controlled atmosphere, precise chemical treatment, and what I believe to be an entirely secure environment, I had achieved what many considered impossible, a rose that seemed to exist outside the natural order of growth and decay." Sir Reginald's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Yet when my gardener, Hartwell, entered the greenhouse that morning for his routine inspection, he found the display case exactly as it had been left, locks intact, seals unbroken, temperature and humidity precisely maintained. But the rose within had been transformed into something else entirely. The room fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the fog-shrouded street below. Even Holmes, rarely surprised by the peculiarities that crossed our threshold, raised an eyebrow in genuine interest. The rose, Sir Reginald continued, had not merely died or withered as flowers naturally do. It had been replaced by what I can only describe as its perfect opposite, a bloom so thoroughly desiccated that it crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, yet arranged in precisely the same position, stem in the same holder, petals maintaining the exact configuration of the original. He gestured toward the rose upon our table. This bloom I found lying beside the case as fresh and perfect as you see it now, though I swear upon my honour that no such rose existed in my greenhouse and the case had not been opened in months. Holmes rose and moved to examine the rose more closely, though he was careful not to disturb it. Most intriguing. Tell me, Sir Reginald, who possessed knowledge of your preservation methods? Who had access to the greenhouse? That is precisely what troubles me most deeply, Mr. Holmes. The process was my secret alone, recorded only in a private journal kept locked in my study. As for access, the greenhouse is secured by locks of my own design, and only 3 individuals possess keys, myself, Hartwell, who has been in my employ for 15 years, and my assistant, young Pemberton, who aids me in my research. And on the day of this discovery, had either of these gentlemen behaved unusually? Had there been any visitors to the estate? Sir Reginald's brow furrowed as he considered the question. Now that you mention it, there had been a visitor the previous evening, a gentleman who claimed to be a fellow botanist from Edinburgh, a Professor Blackwood. He expressed great interest in my work and seemed remarkably well informed about my methods, though I was certain I had never met him before. We spoke for perhaps an hour in my study, during which time he asked several pointed questions about the preservation process. The case was beginning to assume those complex dimensions that Holmes found most appealing. As I observed my friend's expression, I could see that he was already weaving together the various threads of this botanical puzzle, his mind racing ahead to possibilities that remained invisible to ordinary perception. Sir Reginald, Holmes said finally, returning to his chair, I believe your instincts regarding this matter are entirely sound. There are indeed elements here that suggest something far more deliberate than any natural phenomenon. With your permission, I should very much like to examine your greenhouse and speak with those who had access to it. Perhaps among your roses and your research we shall find the key to this most singular mystery. The following morning found Holmes in that state of restless energy that invariably preceded his most intensive investigations. I discovered him at breakfast, fully dressed, despite the early hour, studying a detailed map of the Kensington district with his magnifying glass while consuming his customary sparse meal of toast and coffee. "Ah, Watson," he remarked without looking up, "I trust you slept better than I. This case has presented me with several fascinating contradictions that have occupied my thoughts throughout the night. A rose preserved beyond nature's laws, yet vulnerable to mysterious substitution. A sealed environment that shows no signs of tampering, yet clearly has been compromised. Most intriguing of all, a visitor whose timing suggests either remarkable coincidence or careful planning. Within the hour, Sir Reginald's carriage arrived to convey us through the morning mist to Ashworth Manor. Our client appeared somewhat more composed than he had the previous evening, though the strain of recent events remained evident in the tightness around his eyes and the nervous manner in which he adjusted his gloves. As we settled into the well-appointed brougham, Holmes fixed his penetrating gaze upon Sir Reginald with that intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of his remarkable demonstrations. "I perceive, Sir Reginald, that you spent considerable time last evening in your observatory, no doubt seeking solace in the familiar precision of celestial mechanics after the chaos that has disrupted your botanical work." Sir Reginald started visibly. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly know that? I mentioned nothing of my astronomical pursuits yesterday." Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. The evidence, while subtle, is quite unmistakable to the trained observer. The fine coating of metallic dust upon your right cuff, consistent with the polishing compounds used on telescope mirrors, the slight but distinct wear pattern on your coat shoulder where a telescope tube has repeatedly rested, and, most tellingly, the faint aroma of the chemical solutions used in photographic plates for celestial photography. You sought comfort in the stars, Sir Reginald, when earthly mysteries proved too perplexing. Our client's expression of amazement gradually gave way to thoughtful consideration. "Your powers of observation are indeed remarkable, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I did spend several hours at my telescope attempting to find some rational framework within which to understand yesterday's impossible events." The remainder of our journey passed in relative silence, with Holmes occasionally requesting clarification on various details of the estate's layout and the routines of Sir Reginald's staff. As we approached Ashworth Manor, the impressive Gothic structure emerged from the morning mist like something from a romantic novel, its towers and elaborate stonework speaking of both wealth and scholarly pursuits. We were met at the entrance by Hartwell, the head gardener, whose weathered features bore an expression of barely concealed anxiety. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the sturdy build and calloused hands of one who had spent his life working with growing things, yet there was something in his manner that suggested recent disturbance of his usual equanimity. "This way, gentlemen," Sir Reginald directed, leading us through a side entrance adorned with botanical illustrations toward the conservatory complex. "I thought it best that you examine the scene before we discuss the matter further." The greenhouse itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, its iron framework supporting panels of the finest glass, creating an environment that seemed to exist apart from the natural world outside. The air within was warm and humid, thick with the rich scents of earth and growing things. Yet underneath these familiar odours, Holmes immediately detected something else. "Most curious," he murmured, pausing just inside the entrance and drawing a deep breath. "There is an astringent quality to the atmosphere here, something that speaks of chemical processes beyond the ordinary requirements of plant cultivation." The famous display case stood at the centre of the greenhouse, its brass fittings gleaming and its glass panels reflecting the filtered sunlight. The padlock remained intact, the wax seal bearing Sir Reginald's personal signet unbroken, yet Holmes approached it with the careful attention of a surgeon examining a patient. Dropping to one knee, he produced his magnifying glass and began a minute examination of the case's base and fittings. After several moments of intense scrutiny, he gestured for my medical bag. "Your smallest blade, Watson, if you please." With delicate precision, he teased forth a tiny shaving of wood from beneath one of the brass hinges. "Observe, Sir Reginald. This wood shows clear evidence of recent disturbance. The grain has been compressed and then allowed to expand again, suggesting that this fitting was removed and replaced within the past few days." Sir Reginald leaned closer, his face pale with the implications. "But that's impossible, Mr. Holmes. The case has remained sealed for months." Holmes rose, his grey eyes bright with the light of discovery. Impossible, perhaps, but not improbable. Someone with considerable skill and intimate knowledge of your security measures has found a way to access this case without disturbing your locks or seals. The question now becomes not whether this was accomplished, but how, and more importantly, by whom. Holmes continued his methodical examination of the display case, his keen eyes noting details that would escape ordinary observation. He knelt once more beside the brass hinges, producing a small magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket. After several moments of intense scrutiny, he gestured for my attention. "Observe, Watson, these minute scratches along the underside of the hinge plate. They form a distinctive pattern suggesting the use of a specialized tool, something thin and flexible, inserted with considerable skill to avoid damaging the surrounding wood." He paused, running his finger along the brass fitting. "More significantly, note the direction of these marks. They curve consistently to the left, indicating that our intruder worked primarily with his left hand." Sir Reginald leaned closer, his face pale with the implications. "You can determine such specifics from mere scratches." "Indeed, the human hand, Sir Reginald, leaves its signature in the most subtle of ways. But there is more." Holmes withdrew a small vial and brush from his pocket, applying a fine powder to the surface of the case's base. Ghostly impressions appeared, revealing the outline of what appeared to be a small, circular object. "Someone placed something here, something that left traces of a chemical compound I associate with photographic processes." Moving to examine the area immediately surrounding the display case, Holmes dropped to his hands and knees, his attention focused on the tiled floor. With tweezers, he carefully extracted several tiny fragments from between the tiles, holding them up to the light streaming through the greenhouse's glass panels. "Crystalline residue," he announced, placing the fragments in a small envelope. "These are the remains of your original preserved rose, Sir Reginald, but they have been altered by some chemical agent. The transformation was not natural decay, but deliberate destruction, accomplished through the application of a desiccating compound of considerable potency." Hartwell, who had been watching these proceedings with growing unease, shifted nervously from foot to foot. Holmes's sharp gaze immediately fixed upon the gardener, noting the man's weathered hands and the distinctive stains upon his fingers. "Tell me, Hartwell," Holmes said, rising to his full height, "you work extensively with preservative compounds in your duties here?" "Aye, sir, but only the common sorts. Copper sulfate for the fungi, lime wash for the benches, nothing like what Sir Reginald uses for his special work." Holmes nodded, but I could see that he was cataloguing every detail of the man's appearance and manner. "And you, Mr. Hartwell, are right-handed, I observe." "The callus pattern on your palm and the wear on your gardening gloves make that quite evident." "You could not have manipulated these hinges in the manner our intruder employed." The gardener's relief was palpable, though he continued to regard Holmes with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Sir Reginald," Holmes continued, "I should very much like to examine that calling card left by your mysterious Professor Blackwood, as well as your private study where you conducted your conversation with him." Our client produced the card from his waistcoat pocket, handing it to Holmes with evident reluctance. The detective examined it closely, first with the naked eye, then with his magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the printing and paper quality. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured. "The typography is precise, suggesting professional printing, yet the paper stock is of inferior quality, inconsistent with the academic credentials claimed. More tellingly, this green smudge along the edge is characteristic of the inks used by certain Fleet Street establishments, not Edinburgh printing houses." Sir Reginald's face darkened with understanding. "Then Professor Blackwood was an impostor?" "The evidence strongly suggests as much. A man of considerable knowledge, perhaps, but one whose credentials are as artificial as his visiting card. Now, if you would be so kind as to lead us to your study, I believe we shall find additional evidence of his true purpose in visiting you. As we prepared to leave the greenhouse, Holmes paused to address a question to Hartwell that seemed to carry particular significance. On the morning you discovered the changed rose, did you notice any unusual odours in the greenhouse, any scents that seemed out of place? The gardener's brow furrowed in concentration. Now that you mention it, sir, there was something sweet but sharp too, like the chemicals Sir Reginald uses, but different somehow. Heavier in the air than usual. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. Thank you, Hartwell. That detail may prove more significant than you realize. As we made our way from the warm, humid atmosphere of the greenhouse toward the main house, I could not help but notice that Holmes's manner had taken on that particular intensity that marked the moments when he began to perceive the true shape of a mystery. The pieces of this botanical puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in his remarkable mind, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly just beyond my own comprehension. The case was assuming those complex dimensions that Holmes found most stimulating, involving not merely the question of how the impossible had been accomplished, but why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to create the appearance of a miracle, only to leave behind evidence of very human intervention. Sir Reginald's study presented a marked contrast to the humid, scientifically controlled environment of the greenhouse. Here was the sanctuary of a true scholar, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes on botany, chemistry, and natural philosophy. The massive oak desk that dominated the center of the room bore the accumulated evidence of years of meticulous research, while the air carried the faint but distinctive aroma of tobacco, leather, and something else that Holmes immediately began to analyze. Professor Blackwood occupied this chair, I presume, Holmes said, moving directly to the leather armchair positioned opposite Sir Reginald's desk. Rather than sitting, he circled it slowly, his keen eyes noting every detail of its condition and surroundings. Indeed he did, Sir Reginald confirmed. We spoke for nearly an hour, during which he displayed a remarkable knowledge of preservation techniques, though I now suspect his expertise was acquired for purposes other than scholarly curiosity. Holmes knelt beside the chair, producing his magnifying glass to examine the carpet beneath. The impressions here tell an interesting story, Watson. Note these scuff marks where the chair legs have been shifted repeatedly. Our visitor was not at ease during your conversation, Sir Reginald. He moved frequently, suggesting either nervousness or intense concentration. Rising, Holmes ran his gloved finger along the chair's armrest. And here we have traces of ash from a particularly strong cigar, quite different from the mild Turkish blend you prefer, I observe. He did indeed smoke one of those offensive things, Sir Reginald replied with evident distaste. Claimed it aided his concentration, though the smell was most disagreeable. Holmes moved to examine the desk itself, his attention drawn to the leather blotter that lay before Sir Reginald's usual seat. Holding it up to the light streaming through the tall windows, he studied its surface with intense concentration. Most illuminating, he murmured, producing a pencil to trace invisible impressions upon the blotter's surface. These pressure marks reveal the mirror image of writing that occurred upon a sheet placed above. The handwriting shows a distinctive leftward slant, quite uncommon in right-handed individuals, and the smearing pattern of the descenders confirms our visitor wrote with his left hand. Sir Reginald leaned closer, his face growing pale as Holmes continued his analysis. The words I can make out include actinic and quinone vapor, terms that would be familiar to someone versed in both preservation and photographic chemistry. Tell me, Sir Reginald, were you called away at any point during your meeting? Briefly, yes. A servant announced the arrival of a telegram, and I excused myself to the hallway. It could not have been more than a few minutes. Long enough for a determined individual to make rapid notes from your private papers, Holmes observed grimly. Your journal containing the preservation formulas. Where was it kept during this conversation? Locked in that drawer. Sir Reginald indicated a brass-fitted compartment built into the desk. I never leave such sensitive material exposed. Holmes examined the lock carefully, noting minute scratches around the keyhole that spoke of recent manipulation. At that moment, we were interrupted by a gentle knock upon the door, followed by the entrance of a young man of slight build, carrying an armload of research materials. "Ah, Pemberton," Sir Reginald said. "Perfect timing. These gentlemen are investigating the Rose incident. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is my research assistant, Mr. Pemberton." The young man appeared startled by our presence, nearly dropping his papers as he adjusted the spectacles perched upon his nose. I immediately noted several details about his appearance: the ink stains upon his fingers, the faint chemical odors that clung to his clothing, and most significantly, the natural way he shifted his materials to his left hand while extending his right in greeting. "Gentlemen," Pemberton said, his voice carrying a slight tremor, "I hope I'm not intruding. I was just returning these laboratory records to Sir Reginald's files." Holmes observed the young man with that penetrating gaze that had unnerved countless subjects of his investigations. "Not at all, Mr. Pemberton. In fact, your arrival is most opportune. You possess access to the greenhouse, I believe?" "Yes, sir. Sir Reginald entrusted me with a key for my evening research. I often work late, cataloguing specimens and monitoring the preservation experiments." His eyes darted nervously between Holmes and Sir Reginald as he spoke. "And on the evening of Professor Blackwood's visit, were you present?" "No, Mr. Holmes. I had departed for my lodgings before the gentleman arrived, though I did encounter him briefly the following morning as he was leaving the estate." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, filing away this information along with his other observations. The case was beginning to assume those complex dimensions he found most fascinating, involving not merely the question of how an impossible substitution had been accomplished, but suggesting a carefully orchestrated scheme of intellectual theft that reached deeper into Sir Reginald's household than initially apparent. Holmes moved with practiced efficiency around Sir Reginald's study, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail that might illuminate the mystery before us. He paused at the leather blotter upon the desk, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the tall windows. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing a pencil to trace invisible impressions upon the blotter's surface. These pressure marks reveal the mirror image of writing that occurred upon a sheet placed above. The handwriting shows a distinctive leftward slant, quite uncommon in right-handed individuals, and the smearing pattern confirms our visitor wrote with his left hand. Sir Reginald leaned closer, his face growing increasingly troubled. "But what could he have been writing? I was present throughout our conversation." "Ah, but you mentioned being called away briefly for a telegram," Holmes replied, his attention now focused on the brass-fitted drawer of the desk, "long enough for a determined individual to make rapid notes from your private papers." He examined the lock carefully, noting minute scratches around the keyhole that spoke of recent and skillful manipulation. At this revelation, Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon young Pemberton, who had grown noticeably pale during these proceedings. "You mentioned encountering Professor Blackwood the following morning, Mr. Pemberton. At what hour would that have been, precisely?" The assistant shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his spectacles with nervous fingers. It must have been quite early, perhaps 6:30. I arrived before dawn to check the overnight temperature readings in the greenhouse. The gentleman was just emerging from the manor, carrying what appeared to be a small travelling case. "A travelling case?" Sir Reginald interjected with evident surprise. He made no mention of staying the night. I assumed he had returned to his hotel in London after our conversation. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "Did you speak with this gentleman, Mr. Pemberton?" "Briefly, yes. He seemed rather startled to encounter me and mumbled something about having forgotten his gloves during the previous evening's visit. He appeared quite eager to depart and hurried toward the main road where, I presume, a conveyance awaited him." "And his manner struck you as unusual in any way?" Pemberton paused, clearly choosing his words with care. "He seemed like a man who had accomplished some urgent business but was anxious to avoid further contact. There was something furtive about his movements, if I may say so." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine the papers Pemberton carried. "Research notes, I see. Would you mind if I examined them? They may contain information relevant to our investigation." With obvious reluctance, the assistant surrendered his materials. Holmes scanned them quickly, his trained eye immediately detecting several anomalies. "These notations are most curious, Mr. Pemberton. The handwriting shifts between your usual script and something quite different in several passages. Moreover, these chemical formulations appear to be copied from another source rather than original observations." The young man's composure began to show signs of strain. "I sometimes transcribe information from various sources for comparative purposes. Sir Reginald encourages thorough research." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested deeper suspicions. "Tell me, in your work with preservation experiments, have you encountered quinone vapors or actinic processes?" The question seemed to strike Pemberton like a physical blow. His face drained of colour, and he gripped his remaining papers more tightly. "Such compounds are occasionally referenced in the literature, but Sir Reginald's methods rely primarily on atmospheric control rather than photographic techniques." "Yet you are familiar with such processes?" "Only theoretically, Mr. Holmes. My university training included some study of photographic chemistry, though it was not my primary focus." Holmes had moved to examine a small leather satchel near Pemberton's usual workspace. "With your permission," he said, though he was already opening the case. Within were several glass vials containing what appeared to be chemical compounds, along with detailed notes written in the same distinctive leftward script. "Most illuminating," Holmes announced, holding up one of the vials to the light. "This appears to be a concentrated desiccating agent, precisely the type of compound that would reduce organic matter to dust within hours. And this," he indicated another vial, "bears the distinctive odour of photographic fixing solution." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and Pemberton's increasingly laboured breathing. Sir Reginald stared at his trusted assistant with a mixture of bewilderment and dawning comprehension. "There is also this," Holmes continued, producing a small brass key that gleamed with recent polishing. "Unless I am much mistaken, this key would fit the locks of your greenhouse display case, Sir Reginald." The evidence against young Pemberton was mounting with each revelation, yet I noticed that Holmes maintained that peculiar expression I had learned to associate with his deeper contemplations. As we prepared to leave the study, he paused at the window, regarding the wet gravel of the drive with thoughtful eyes. "The circumstantial evidence is certainly compelling," he remarked quietly to me as we walked. "One might even say remarkably so. Almost too perfectly aligned, would you not agree, Watson?" His words carried a weight that suggested the case, despite its apparent clarity, harboured complexities we had yet to uncover. The web of evidence pointed unmistakably toward Pemberton, yet Holmes's manner indicated that he suspected we were seeing only the surface of a more elaborate deception. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot, but I sensed that the true nature of our quarry remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Holmes did not, however, allow the apparently damning discoveries to precipitate a hasty conclusion. Instead, he regarded young Pemberton with that peculiar mixture of sympathy and calculation that marked his approach to those caught in webs not entirely of their own weaving. "One moment, if you please," said he, moving to examine more closely the brass key that had been found among the assistant's possessions. Rather than attempting to insert it into the display case lock, Holmes knelt beside the mechanism and produced a small measuring device from his waistcoat pocket. After several moments of careful examination, he straightened with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Most illuminating, Watson, this key, while superficially similar to the original, bears wards cut to entirely different specifications. It would no more open Sir Reginald's display case than it would unlock the Tower of London." Sir Reginald stared in bewilderment. "But then, why would Pemberton possess such a thing?" "Because, my dear Sir Reginald, someone wished it to be found in his possession. Consider the remarkable convenience of this evidence: chemical compounds neatly arranged for discovery, a false key placed where it would inevitably be noticed, notes written in a hand that superficially resembles Pemberton's left-handed script, yet lacks the natural flow of his genuine writing." Holmes moved to the blotter once more, comparing the pressure marks with a sample of Pemberton's authentic handwriting. "Observe, Watson, how the genuine script shows the characteristic hesitations and individual letter formations of natural writing, while these impressions display the deliberate strokes of someone copying an unfamiliar hand." The young assistant's relief was palpable, though his confusion remained evident. "Mr. Holmes, I swear to you that those compounds are not mine, nor do I understand how they came to be in my satchel." "I believe you, Mr. Pemberton, though the question remains as to how they arrived there." Holmes turned his attention back to the display case itself, examining the brass fittings with renewed intensity. "Watson, you will recall that we have solved the mystery of how the preserved rose was destroyed, yet we have entirely overlooked the greater puzzle: how did the fresh rose come to be in its place?" This observation struck me with the force of revelation. In our focus upon the mechanical aspects of the substitution, we had indeed failed to account for the appearance of the perfect bloom that had been found beside the case. Holmes continued his examination of the case's base, producing his thin steel probe to explore the junction between wood and metal. "Here we have our answer," he announced, indicating a hair-thin channel cut with extraordinary precision beneath the brass fitting. "A conduit through which chemical vapors could be introduced without disturbing the locks or seals, the work of someone with considerable skill in both chemistry and precision metalwork." "But the fresh rose, Holmes," I pressed, sensing that this remained the key to unravelling the true nature of the deception. "Ah, Watson, there lies the heart of our mystery. The destruction of the preserved specimen was merely the dramatic flourish designed to create an impossible puzzle and direct suspicion toward those with access to the greenhouse. The fresh rose, however, represents something far more significant. It is the signature of someone who wishes us to know that this was no mere theft, but an intellectual challenge." Holmes moved to examine the area around the display case more carefully, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "Note these minute glass fragments, Watson, embedded in the putty around this particular pane. Someone has removed and replaced this section of the greenhouse wall, creating an alternate means of access that bypassed all of Sir Reginald's security measures. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Our mysterious Professor Blackwood had not merely stolen Sir Reginald's formula, he had transformed the theft into an elaborate puzzle, one designed to test the limits of detection while simultaneously providing a convenient scapegoat in the person of young Pemberton. "Sir Reginald," Holmes said, his voice carrying that tone of quiet authority that marked his most crucial deductions, "I believe we are dealing with someone who knows your household intimately, someone who understood not only your preservation methods, but also the daily routines of your staff and the psychology of those around you. This was not the work of a casual intruder, but of someone who has been planning this elaborate deception for considerable time." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows through the greenhouse's glass panels, Holmes set about preparing what I recognized as one of his characteristic traps. "Stison, I believe our mysterious Professor Blackwood will not be content with his initial success. The theatrical nature of this crime suggests someone who delights in intellectual games, and such individuals rarely resist the temptation to observe the results of their handiwork firsthand. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not only Holmes's deductive abilities, but also his understanding of the criminal mind that had orchestrated this most ingenious of deceptions. The game, as he was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and I sensed that the true revelation lay just beyond the gathering dusk. Holmes spent the remainder of that afternoon in a state of intense concentration, his mind clearly working through the complex psychological dimensions of our adversary. "Watson," he said, settling into the chair beside Sir Reginald's desk, "we are dealing with a criminal of exceptional vanity and intellectual pride. The theatrical nature of this crime, the careful staging of evidence against young Pemberton, the symbolic replacement of the preserved rose with a fresh bloom, these are not mere practical considerations, but artistic flourishes designed to demonstrate superiority." Sir Reginald leaned forward with evident concern. "But what does such a person want beyond the theft of my formula?" "Recognition, Sir Reginald, acknowledgement of their cleverness, and most importantly, the satisfaction of witnessing our confusion and failure. Such minds cannot resist returning to observe the fruits of their handiwork, particularly if they believe their triumph might be threatened." Holmes rose and moved to the window, his keen eyes scanning the grounds with calculating precision. "We shall provide them with irresistible bait." Within the hour, Holmes had orchestrated a carefully crafted deception. Sir Reginald was instructed to send a telegram to several prominent members of the Royal Botanical Society, hinting that despite recent setbacks, his research had yielded an even more extraordinary breakthrough, a preservation technique that rendered organic matter virtually indestructible. The message was deliberately worded to suggest that the previous night's incident had actually revealed new possibilities rather than representing a defeat. "Our quarry will learn of this communication through channels we need not specify," Holmes explained with evident satisfaction. "Such intelligence will prove unbearable to someone who has invested considerable effort in demonstrating the fallibility of your methods." As evening approached, Holmes began preparing his more tangible trap within the greenhouse itself. He strung a hair-thin wire across the loosened glass panel he had discovered, coating it with a mixture that would leave distinctive traces on anyone who disturbed it. Near the display case, he positioned a shallow dish containing a chemical solution that would react visibly to the quinone vapors our intruder had previously employed. "The beauty of this arrangement, Watson, lies in its dual nature," Holmes explained as he made his final adjustments. "If our visitor attempts the same chemical method as before, the solution will betray him. If he chooses a more direct approach, the wire will provide evidence of his presence." We took up our positions shortly after midnight, concealed within a small potting shed that afforded an excellent view of the entire greenhouse. Sir Reginald, despite his obvious nervousness, maintained admirable composure as we settled into what promised to be a lengthy vigil. The November fog pressed against the glass panels, transforming familiar shapes into mysterious shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim starlight. Holmes remained absolutely motionless beside me, his senses attuned to the slightest disturbance in the night's natural rhythm. The greenhouse held that peculiar silence of growing things at rest, broken only by the occasional drip of condensation and the distant sounds of London's restless streets. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Holmes's hand suddenly gripped my arm with silent urgency. At first I could detect nothing unusual, but then I heard it, the faintest scraping sound from the direction of the compromised glass panel. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness began to take shape against the fog-diffused moonlight, moving with the careful precision of someone intimately familiar with the greenhouse's layout. The figure paused at the glass panel, and I could see gloved hands working at its edges with practiced efficiency. Holmes's breathing had become so controlled as to be almost imperceptible, and I knew that we were witnessing the return of our mysterious Professor Blackwood to the scene of his elaborate crime. The intruder worked with the quiet precision of a craftsman executing a well-rehearsed plan. Through our concealed position, we observed him manipulate the loosened glass panel with remarkable dexterity, his movements speaking of considerable experience in such nocturnal enterprises. As he slipped through the opening, Holmes's carefully prepared trap immediately came into effect. The nearly invisible wire caught against his dark clothing, leaving its telltale chemical traces while the man remained entirely unaware of his marking. Within the greenhouse, the figure moved with surprising confidence toward the display case, his familiarity with the layout evident in every step. He was of medium height and compact build, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the fog-shrouded glass panels. From his coat, he withdrew a small apparatus consisting of a rubber bulb attached to a length of thin tubing, fitting the end to the hairline channel beneath the brass fitting that Holmes had discovered earlier. Holmes remained absolutely motionless beside me, though I could sense the coiled tension in his form as he observed every detail of the intruder's methodology. The man began to depress the bulb with his left hand in slow, measured pulses, and almost immediately an acrid sweetness reached us, the distinctive chemical reek of quinone vapor. The shallow dish Holmes had positioned nearby responded at once, its contents shifting to a ghostly opalescence under the vapor's invisible influence, confirming our suspicions about the method used to destroy Sir Reginald's preserved rose. The intruder waited a moment, as though verifying the effect of his chemical assault, then withdrew the apparatus and produced a small tin from his satchel. Holmes's lips brushed my ear with the faintest whisper. "Not yet, Watson. Let us observe his complete methodology before we spring our own trap." When Holmes finally rose, it was with that pantherine suddenness I had learned to associate with his most dramatic interventions. The door of our concealment opened and closed, upon his passage, scarcely more audibly than a sigh, with Sir Reginald and myself following in his wake. "That will suffice," Holmes announced in his coldest voice, stepping into the humid atmosphere of the greenhouse. The figure sprang back from the display case, his right hand flashing toward his coat. A small glass ampule shattered against the flagstones with a sharp crack, releasing a white, choking cloud that stung the eyes and clawed at the throat like spirits of ammonia. Through the watery blur of my involuntary tears, I saw the intruder vault toward the fernery, scattering clay pots in his wake as he sought to reach the compromised glass panel. He moved with surprising speed and agility, striking at the overhead lantern with the back of his hand and plunging us into near darkness. What little light remained cast his shadow long and leaping as he fled through the maze of botanical specimens. Despite the chaos of his escape, I noticed that he favored his left arm, keeping it tucked protectively against his body even as he ran, a curious detail that Holmes would undoubtedly find significant. We burst into the raw night air as our quarry slipped through the loosened panel and vanished among the laurel bushes. Holmes did not pursue blindly, but cut across the lawn at a calculated angle, reasoning that the most direct path to the service gate would allow him to intercept the fleeing figure. The November fog swirled around us like torn gauze, muffling sounds and transforming familiar shapes into ghostly uncertainties. When we reached the gate, we found clear evidence of premeditation. The lower rail had been hooked back, and a length of cord dangled from the latch, suggesting our intruder had prepared multiple escape routes. Holmes examined these arrangements with grim satisfaction. "He's no mere improviser, Watson. Every detail has been planned with meticulous care." Near the greenhouse entrance, Holmes discovered a leather glove caught on the loosened panel's frame, its palms smeared with the luminous paste from our trap. Within the glove, a maker's mark was stamped in fading gilt. "Hargreaves, Clerkenwell," Holmes read softly. "Instrument maker's outfitter of some distinction." Beside the shattered display case, we found a slender, spring-loaded tool with a recurved tip, clearly the work of a precision craftsman rather than any common burglar's implement. Most significantly, on the stone where the smoke bomb had exploded lay the pale crescent of ash from what Holmes immediately identified as a Trichinopoly cigar, the same distinctive tobacco that Professor Blackwood had favoured during his visit to Sir Reginald's study. As we completed our examination of the greenhouse, Holmes suddenly straightened with an expression of urgent realization. "To the study, Watson! Our adversary plays a double stroke. The greenhouse was merely the distraction for a more significant theft." Sir Reginald led us through a side entrance to his private study, where we discovered that Holmes's suspicion had proved entirely accurate. The lock had been forced with professional skill, papers lay scattered from the brass-fitted drawer, and the space that should have contained Sir Reginald's precious research journal gaped empty as a plundered vault. The window above the desk stood slightly ajar, its putty parted in a clean line that precisely matched the technique used on the greenhouse panel. Holmes knelt beside the windowsill, his trained nose detecting the faint but unmistakable trace of quinone vapor. "He masked his scent with his own chemistry," Holmes observed, "but the residue remains. Note also these heel impressions, the mark of a fashionable boot, yet with the broader forepart that craftsmen favour for stability. A man who moves between workshops and drawing rooms with equal facility." Sir Reginald stood, with one hand upon the violated drawer, his face drawn with the realization of his loss. "Then he has succeeded in stealing my life's work." "For the moment," Holmes replied, carefully wrapping the glove, the precision tool, and the cigar ash in separate papers. "He believes he has concluded his elaborate demonstration. In reality, he has furnished us with a complete portrait of his methods and identity. At dawn we shall visit Clerkenwell and trace these instruments to their source. Our adversary's vanity and precision have provided us with the very threads we need to unravel his carefully woven deception." The fog pressed closer against the windows as if seeking to eavesdrop upon our conversation. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon the perfect rose that Sir Reginald had brought us, now resting upon the desk in mute defiance of natural decay. "He has taken the journal," Holmes said quietly, "but in doing so he has revealed the path that leads directly to his door. The rose that never withered indeed has thorns, Watson, and tomorrow we shall discover who bleeds when we grasp them." The grey dawn found Holmes and myself aboard a hansom cab threading through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, that industrious district where London's finest craftsmen maintained workshops unchanged for generations. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing soot-blackened facades housing everything from clockmakers to scientific instrument manufacturers, their windows already glowing with the warm light of forge fires and precision lamps. Holmes sat forward with evident anticipation, the leather glove and peculiar tool wrapped carefully in his coat pocket. The beauty of specialized trades, Watson, lies in their insularity. A craftsman who creates instruments of such precision will be known intimately to his peers, and the maker's mark will lead us directly to our quarry's source. We alighted before the narrow frontage of Hargreaves and Sons, its dusty window displaying an array of mathematical instruments and delicate tools beloved of mechanicians and scientific men. The proprietor, a wizened man whose fingers bore the permanent stains of metal polish and fine oils, examined Holmes's evidence with the reverence of one who understood true craftsmanship. "Aye, that's our work," he confirmed, turning the spring-loaded tool in his gnarled hands. Made to special order not 3 weeks past, the gentleman who commissioned it brought most particular drawings, specified the exact curvature and spring tension required, called himself Professor Blackwood initially, though he paid under the name Blake when collecting the finished piece. Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "You recall this customer clearly?" "Indeed I do, sir. Not often we get orders for such specialized implements. Gentleman of middle years, well dressed, but with the hands of one who works with delicate mechanisms. Left-handed, I noted, by the way he handled my samples. Spoke with considerable authority about metallurgy and precision engineering, suggesting extensive knowledge of both botanical and photographic processes. The craftsman consulted his leather-bound ledger with pages yellowed by decades of use. Paid in advance with gold sovereigns which fixed him in my memory. Said he required the tool for extracting specimens from sealed containers without disturbing atmospheric conditions. Mentioned working in converted premises, complained about the challenges of maintaining proper ventilation in older buildings. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. Our mysterious adversary had indeed planned his elaborate theft with meticulous attention to detail, commissioning specialized tools weeks in advance while establishing multiple false identities through careful preparation. From Hargreaves, we proceeded to the offices of Bradshaw and Company, estate agents specializing in commercial properties within London's scientific districts. Holmes's reputation preceded him here, and the senior partner received us with evident curiosity about our unusual inquiry regarding laboratory spaces with specific modifications. "Gentlemen, seeking converted premises for chemical work," Bradshaw mused, consulting his records. "We handled one such arrangement recently that matches your description precisely. A Professor Blackwood leased the Pemberton building on Rosemary Lane, specifically requesting premises with existing glass panels that could be modified for scientific purposes." The connection struck both Holmes and myself with considerable force. Our mysterious Professor Blackwood had not merely adopted a false identity, he had deliberately chosen circumstances that would create confusion and potentially implicate Sir Reginald's innocent assistant through nominal similarity. This Professor Blackwood demonstrated remarkable familiarity with the building's history, Bradshaw continued. The space had formerly housed a photographic studio which explained the specialized glass installations and chemical drainage systems. He seemed to know more about the property than I did myself, suggesting either extensive research or previous acquaintance with the premises. Holmes's eyes sharpened with understanding. "The lease commenced 6 weeks ago, with payment in advance for a full year. Most unusual arrangement, with specific requests that no maintenance staff enter without prior notice." As we made our way toward Rosemary Lane, Holmes outlined his developing theory. Our adversary has constructed an elaborate identity centered around exploiting coincidental names and circumstances. The choice of aliases, the selection of premises that would create confusion through nominal similarity, the careful timing of his approach to Sir Reginald, all suggest a mind that delights in creating intellectual puzzles while maintaining multiple layers of deception. The Pemberton building stood before us, a narrow structure of blackened brick wedged between commercial establishments. Its upper windows had been modified with specialized glass panels, and even from the street we could detect faint chemical odors that spoke of active laboratory work within. Holmes paused before the building's entrance, his keen eyes noting the fresh scratches around the lock and the faint, luminous traces from our trap still visible on the door frame. Our quarry has returned to his lair, Watson, marked by his own chemistry. The rose that never withered has led us to its source, and within these walls we shall discover not merely the identity of our thief, but the true purpose behind his theatrical demonstration of intellectual superiority. The stage was set for our final confrontation with the architect of this most elaborate botanical mystery. Holmes approached the building with that calculated precision I had learned to associate with his most dangerous encounters. The morning light revealed subtle modifications to the structure that spoke of careful preparation, ventilation shafts installed with considerable skill, and the acrid sweetness of chemical processes hanging in the air like an invisible signature of active scientific work within. Rather than attempting the front entrance, Holmes guided me through a narrow alley that provided access to the building's rear. Here, his keen eyes immediately detected the luminous traces from our trap still clinging to the doorframe, confirming that our quarry had indeed returned to his sanctuary. The multiple locks arranged in careful sequence rather than parallel formation told their own story of a man who feared pursuit and wished to delay rather than merely exclude unwanted visitors. The sounds emanating from within suggested intense laboratory work in progress. Through a partially opened window, we could hear the methodical clink of glass apparatus and the soft hiss of chemical reactions under careful control. Holmes positioned himself to observe the interior while remaining concealed, and what we witnessed exceeded even his expectations for scientific criminality. The converted space had been transformed into a remarkable laboratory that combined botanical preservation with photographic chemistry in ways that revealed genuine innovation alongside criminal intent. Glass cases containing perfectly preserved specimens lined one wall while sophisticated photographic equipment dominated the opposite side. At the center of this scientific domain stood our mysterious Professor Blackwood, though in the clear morning light his true identity became unmistakably apparent. The man we had pursued through the fog-shrouded greenhouse was Dr. Marcus Pemberton, not the young assistant we had met at Sir Reginald's estate, but clearly his father, whose resemblance explained the deliberate confusion of names and circumstances that had nearly implicated the innocent young man. The theatrical Professor Blackwood had vanished, replaced by a scientist whose genuine expertise was evident in every movement as he worked with focused intensity, transferring information from Sir Reginald's stolen journal into his own meticulously organized records. Holmes watched for several minutes, cataloguing every detail of the man's methodology. "Most illuminating, Watson," he whispered. "We are witnessing not merely theft, but the culmination of a scientific rivalry that has driven a brilliant mind to elaborate criminality. Observe how he handles Sir Reginald's notes, not with the greed of a common thief, but with the reverence of one who truly understands their significance." Dr. Pemberton's left arm, which we had noticed him favouring during his escape, was supported by a leather brace that suggested some chronic weakness. As he worked, he dictated notes to himself in the manner of one accustomed to solitude, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed his greatest triumph was within reach. The synthesis of quinone stabilization with atmospheric control represents a breakthrough that poor Ashworth could never have achieved through his limited understanding of photographic chemistry, he was saying, as we positioned ourselves outside the laboratory door. The theatrical demonstration was necessary to establish the superiority of my methods while simultaneously acquiring his incomplete formulations. Holmes smiled with grim satisfaction at this inadvertent confession. Our mysterious adversary had revealed not only his identity and methods, but his motive, a scientific rivalry transformed into elaborate criminality through wounded pride and intellectual vanity. The coincidence of names, the intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's household routines, the sophisticated understanding of both botanical and chemical processes, all now made perfect sense as the actions of a professional rival seeking to demonstrate intellectual superiority. With characteristic decisiveness, Holmes chose the direct approach that would allow him to confront not merely the man's criminality, but his intellect. He applied his lockpicks to the front entrance with practiced efficiency, and we ascended the narrow stairs with that peculiar silence he could achieve when circumstances demanded stealth. The chemical odors grew stronger as we approached the laboratory level, where Dr. Pemberton remained completely absorbed in transcribing Sir Reginald's secrets, surrounded by the fruits of his elaborate deception. The irony was not lost on me that the theft of one man's research had led to genuine innovations that might benefit scientific knowledge, were they not tainted by criminal methodology. Holmes paused at the laboratory door, which stood slightly ajar, allowing us to observe the final moments of Dr. Pemberton's triumph before justice would claim its due. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not merely Holmes's deductive abilities, but his understanding of the criminal mind in its most sophisticated manifestation, that of a brilliant scientist whose wounded pride had transformed legitimate research into an elaborate crime of intellectual vanity. Holmes stepped through the laboratory door with that quiet authority that had marked our most dramatic revelations, his presence immediately transforming the chemical-laden atmosphere into a stage for justice. Dr. Marcus Pemberton straightened slowly from his work at the bench, his weathered features showing no surprise at our arrival, but rather the resigned intelligence of a man whose elaborate game had reached its inevitable conclusion. "Good morning, Dr. Pemberton," Holmes announced, his voice carrying that cool precision which had unnerved countless criminals before this one. "Or should I continue the charade of Professor Blackwood, though I suspect such theatrical disguises have lost their appeal now that the final curtain approaches?" The older man set down his pen with deliberate care, his left arm remaining protectively cradled against his side. For a long moment he studied Holmes with the calculating gaze of one brilliant mind recognizing another. "Mr. Holmes," he said finally, "I confess I have been expecting you since dawn. Your reputation for following the most delicate threads to their source is well established, and I fear my vanity provided you with rather more threads than prudence would have advised." Holmes moved further into the laboratory, his keen eyes cataloguing the sophisticated apparatus that surrounded us. The preserved specimens lining the walls spoke of genuine scientific achievement, yet they could not diminish the criminal purpose that had brought us to this confrontation. "Your son's resemblance to you is striking, Dr. Pemberton, though I suspect that resemblance was deliberately exploited to create confusion should your activities be discovered." A shadow of pain crossed the older man's features. "Young Marcus knows nothing of my work here, Mr. Holmes. His position in Sir Reginald's household provided intelligence about security arrangements, yes, but he remains entirely innocent of my methods. The coincidence of our shared surname was too perfect an opportunity to resist when establishing my false identity, but I would not have him suffer for my choices." Holmes nodded, moving to examine Sir Reginald's stolen journal lying open beside Dr. Pemberton's meticulous notes. "Your rivalry with Sir Reginald extends beyond mere professional jealousy," I observe. "These specimens demonstrate genuine innovation, yet you felt compelled to steal his research rather than pursue recognition through legitimate channels." Dr. Pemberton's expression darkened with long-held resentment. 20 years ago, Mr. Holmes, Reginald Ashworth and I were colleagues, partners, in developing the atmospheric preservation methods that made his fame and fortune. When our joint research reached its crucial breakthrough, he claimed sole credit, publishing our discoveries under his name alone, while I was recovering from the accident that damaged my left arm and forced me from active laboratory work. The pieces of this complex puzzle were falling into their final arrangement with that satisfying precision that marked Holmes's finest cases. "The rose that never withered was your masterpiece," Holmes observed, "not merely a theft, but a demonstration that your methods surpassed those of your former colleague. The theatrical elements, the quinone vapor, introduced through the hairline channel beneath the brass fitting the fresh rose left as your signature, these were designed not just to confound investigation, but to establish intellectual superiority. The synthesis of photographic chemistry with botanical preservation represents years of solitary research," Dr. Pemberton confirmed, with evident pride. "The demonstration was necessary to prove the superiority of my methods while acquiring the final pieces I needed to complete my work." Holmes examined the specialized tool we had traced from Hargreaves of Clerkenwell. "Your planning was meticulous. The false visiting card, the rented laboratory under a name designed to implicate your son, the careful timing of your visits to coincide with household routines you had studied through his innocent reports. Yet in your desire for vindication, you committed crimes that will overshadow any legitimate scientific achievement." At that moment, the heavy tread of boots upon the stairs announced Inspector Lestrade's arrival, accompanied by 2 constables whose presence filled the narrow laboratory. Lestrade's sharp eyes took in the scene with that mixture of suspicion and grudging admiration that Holmes's cases invariably inspired. "Well, Mr. Holmes," the inspector said, "you promised me our Professor Blackwood, and here I find you've delivered him complete with laboratory and evidence. Will he come quietly, or shall we expect more of those smoke bombs?" Dr. Pemberton made no attempt to flee or destroy evidence. Instead, he carefully closed Sir Reginald's journal and placed it beside his own research, his manner, suggesting a man who had achieved his primary objective and was prepared to face the consequences. "There will be no struggle, Inspector. I have made my point, and Mr. Holmes has made his." Holmes addressed the prisoner with unexpected gentleness. "Your innovations are genuine, Dr. Pemberton, and your grievances may well have merit. Your error lay in supposing that scientific achievement excuses criminal methodology, and that wounded pride justifies elaborate deception." As the handcuffs closed upon Dr. Pemberton's wrists, he looked directly at Sir Reginald, who had remained silent throughout these proceedings. "The irony, Reginald, is that my techniques genuinely surpass those that made you famous. The rose that never withered represents a breakthrough that could revolutionize botanical preservation, yet it will be remembered only as evidence of my criminality." Sir Reginald accepted his recovered journal with hands that trembled slightly. "Marcus," he said quietly, "if I wronged you 20 years ago, I did so without full understanding of the consequences. Your brilliance was never in question, only your methods." The legal proceedings that followed were conducted with the dignity that marked Victorian justice at its finest. Dr. Pemberton provided a complete confession that explicitly exonerated his son while detailing the sophisticated methods he had employed. The evidence Holmes had gathered, the specialized tools, the chemical traces, The testimonies from Hargreaves and the estate agents formed an unassailable case that left no doubt of guilt while establishing the elaborate nature of the deception. Young Pemberton arrived at Sir Reginald's estate that evening, pale with the knowledge of his father's crimes, but profoundly grateful for his own exoneration. His dignity in the face of such revelation spoke well of his character, and Sir Reginald's offer of continued employment provided a foundation for rebuilding trust that had been so thoroughly shaken. As our hansom carried us back through London's gas-lit streets toward Baker Street, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, the perfect rose that had begun our investigation resting in his lap. Its petals maintained their impossible freshness through Dr. Pemberton's revolutionary techniques, a testament to genuine scientific achievement forever tainted by criminal application. "The rose that never withered has indeed revealed its secrets, Watson," Holmes observed as we approached our familiar lodgings. Yet the greatest mystery was not how the impossible was accomplished, but why a brilliant mind chose the path of deception over the harder road of legitimate recognition. I ventured that wounded pride seemed a poor foundation for such elaborate criminality. Holmes smiled with that thin, distant expression I had learned to associate with his deepest insights. "Pride, Watson, is perhaps the most dangerous of human failings when coupled with genuine ability. It transforms legitimate achievement into criminal ambition and blinds brilliant minds to the very principles they claim to serve." The case concluded with Dr. Pemberton receiving a sentence of 5 years' imprisonment, reduced in consideration of his cooperation and the mitigating circumstances of his original grievance. His scientific innovations, documented in the recovered materials, eventually found their way into legitimate research channels, though his name would forever be associated with the elaborate crime that had revealed them. As I set down these final words of our investigation, I reflect upon the complex lessons embedded within this most unusual case. The rose that never withered served as both symbol and warning, a reminder that even the most perfect achievements can be corrupted by the methods employed to obtain them, and that true preservation lies not in defying nature's laws, but in maintaining the integrity that allows genuine accomplishment to flourish without the shadow of deception. Holmes characteristically had already moved on to examining the morning's correspondence, his remarkable mind no doubt already engaged with London's next puzzle. Yet I suspect that the case of the rose that never withered will remain among his most instructive, demonstrating, as it did, that the greatest mysteries often arise not from impossible circumstances, but from the all-too-human complexities of pride, ambition, and the eternal struggle between justice and recognition.